The air inside the Chicago courthouse was a physical weight, thick with unspoken anxieties and the faint, dusty scent of old law books. Every sound was amplified in the cavernous space: a lawyer's cough, the rustle of paper, the soft click of a briefcase latch. Dark, polished wood paneled the walls, rising to a ceiling so high it seemed to belong to another world, a world of gods and judgments far removed from the mortals below. Cold marble floors reflected the solemn light filtering through the tall, arched windows, and each footstep echoed with a lonely finality. It was a place designed to make a person feel small, to impress upon them the immense, impersonal power of the law. At the defendant's table, a man in a worn-out workshirt sat hunched over, his face pale with terror, a stark contrast to the sharp, expensive suits of the attorneys who moved with practiced confidence around him. Presiding over it all was Judge Arthur Caldwell, a man who seemed carved from the same unyielding material as the courthouse itself. At 62, he was the embodiment of judicial authority, his reputation as the gavel, earned through 2 decades of merciless sentences and an unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. His grey hair was perfectly styled, his suit tailored to perfection, but these details couldn't hide the permanent bitterness etched around his mouth or the profound emptiness in his eyes. He commanded the room from a motorized wheelchair, a constant, humming reminder of the accident that had stolen his legs and his wife 20 years prior. The chair was both his throne of power and his inescapable prison, a symbol of the cruel irony that defined him, a man who held absolute control over the fates of others, yet was utterly powerless to change his own. In the front row of the gallery, a small figure sat perfectly still, a beacon of innocence in a sea of cynicism. Her name was Lily, the defendant's 8-year-old daughter. Her clothes were simple and slightly faded, but meticulously clean. She hugged herself tightly, her immense, luminous brown eyes fixed on her father, filled not with despair, but with a stubborn, unwavering hope that felt almost defiant in that cold room. Just as Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, the sound a dry crackle in the deathly silence, preparing to deliver the verdict that would shatter her world. Lily's thin, clear voice sliced through the tension. "Let my father go, and I'll make you walk." A ripple of scornful pity moved through the onlookers. The prosecutor smirked, and the defense attorney buried his face in his hands. Judge Caldwell's initial reaction was a flash of cold irritation. He fixed his gaze on the child, his lips parting to order her immediate removal from his courtroom. But when his eyes met hers, he froze. He saw no childish fantasy, no delusion, only an absolute, unshakable faith that seemed to reach across the room and touch something deep inside him. For 5 impossible seconds, a sensation he hadn't felt in 20 years surged through his body, an intense warmth, an unmistakable tingling that shot down his paralyzed legs. He glanced down, his heart pounding, and saw it. The big toe on his right foot twitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. No one else saw. It was a private miracle, a secret whispered between him and the universe, sparked by a little girl's belief. The hard shell he had built around his heart didn't just crack, it shattered. It's in moments like this, when reality itself seems to bend, that we are reminded of the power of belief. If these kinds of stories resonate with you, please consider subscribing, as it allows us to continue sharing them. The sound of the gavel was a thunderclap in a silent church, an explosion that shattered the stunned stillness of the courtroom. Before the whispers could coalesce into a full-blown uproar, Judge Caldwell's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air. He ordered his bailiff to clear the gallery and instructed the stunned attorneys to return to their offices. He wanted to see the defendant and his daughter in his chambers, immediately and alone. The request was so far outside of judicial protocol that it bordered on the absurd, but no one dared to question him. The raw, desperate authority in his voice was something new, something far more volatile than his usual cold fury. As his motorized wheelchair whirred towards the heavy oak doors of his private office, he felt like a man running from a fire, not knowing if he was fleeing towards safety or a greater conflagration. His chambers were a fortress of solitude and power, a place where he had condemned men for 2 decades. The walls were lined with leather-bound law books that smelled of dust and finality, and a large, somber portrait of his late wife, Eleanor, hung over the fireplace. Her painted eyes a constant, silent judgment. Into this hallowed space stepped Mark and Lily's father, a man who seemed to shrink in the presence of so much mahogany and leather, and his daughter, who looked around with a child's simple curiosity, unafraid. Caldwell positioned his chair behind his massive desk, a familiar shield of authority, but the moment he looked at them, the shield dissolved. He was no longer the gavel, the unassailable arbiter of justice. He was just Arthur, a broken man in a broken body, staring at the impossible source of a feeling he thought had died with his wife. He cleared his throat, but the sound that emerged was not the booming baritone of the courtroom. It was softer, strained, laced with a terrifying vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 20 years. He bypassed the father completely, his gaze fixed on the small girl who stood holding her father's hand. "How?" he asked. The single word hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of his entire life. Lily did not flinch. She looked at him with her impossibly clear eyes and answered with the straightforward logic of a child. "I just asked God," she said, her voice a soft melody. "I told him you looked so sad, and that if he fixed your pain, maybe you could let my daddy come home. I said he didn't do what they said he did." The simplicity of it was a physical blow, more powerful than any legal argument he had ever heard. A war raged within him, 2 decades of hardened cynicism, of belief only in the cold, hard facts of evidence and precedent, screamed that this was a coincidence, a hallucination, a cruel trick of a desperate mind. But the phantom warmth still lingered in his legs, a ghost of a memory that felt more real than the desk in front of him. He looked at Mark's face, etched with the weariness of a man wrongly accused, and for the first time he didn't see a case file or a docket number. He saw a father. He saw a man whose world was about to be destroyed, just as his had been. In that instant, a decision was made, not by the judge, but by the man. It was irrational, unprofessional, and potentially career-ending. "I'm reopening the case," he stated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. The fallout was immediate and severe. The prosecutor, a sharp and ambitious man named Peterson, stormed into his chambers later that day, accusing him of judicial misconduct, of being emotionally compromised. News of the unprecedented recess and the private meeting leaked to the press, and whispers began to circulate through the city's legal community. Was Judge Caldwell losing his mind? Was he succumbing to the pressures of his lonely life? The system he had served so faithfully began to turn on him, its gears grinding in protest against this sudden, inexplicable injection of raw humanity. He had built his reputation on being an unmovable pillar of the law, and now, by showing a crack in his facade, he had made himself a target for every ambitious lawyer and sensationalist journalist in Chicago. It's in these quiet moments of impossible choice, when logic wars with a feeling you can't explain, that a person's true character is forged. For 20 years, Arthur Caldwell had chosen the path of bitter certainty, but now he was stepping into the terrifying wilderness of faith. If you believe in the power of these turning points and how a single moment can redefine a life, subscribing to our channel ensures more stories like this can be told. His decision wasn't just about a legal case. It was an act of rebellion against the prison he had built for himself, a desperate gamble on the hope that a little girl's faith could be more real than his own pain, a gamble he was now willing to stake his entire world on. That night, alone in his sprawling, empty house, The ghosts of his past came for him. He remembered the accident with a clarity that was excruciating. The slick, rain-soaked asphalt of Lakeshore Drive, the blinding headlights of the truck that ran the red light, the sound of shattering glass and twisting metal that seemed to go on forever. But most of all, he remembered turning to see Eleanor, her head against the passenger window, her eyes open but seeing nothing. He had survived, but the man he was had died with her on that road. The bitterness that followed was a shield, a way to keep the world at bay, to punish it for what it had taken from him. Now, that shield was gone, and the raw, unhealed wound of his grief was exposed to the air once more. While the judge wrestled with his demons, Lily and her father returned to their own world, a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood the city had mostly forgotten. Their life was a quiet testament to struggle and love. Mark worked 2 low-wage jobs, his hands calloused and his body perpetually tired, all to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Lily was his entire world. The reason he endured the shame and fear of the trial. Her faith wasn't born in a church pew. It was forged in the reality of their life. When you have nothing else, belief becomes your most valuable possession. Her prayers each night weren't for toys or treats, but for her father's safety and for the sadness to leave the judge's eyes. Caldwell, acting with a newfound urgency, bypassed the system entirely. He used his personal fortune to hire a retired, grizzled private investigator named Frank, a man whose loyalty was to the truth, not to a prosecutor's office. Frank was the best, a bloodhound who could smell a lie from a mile away. Together, they began to dissect the case against Mark. They worked late into the nights in Caldwell's study, surrounded by case files and lukewarm coffee. It didn't take long for Frank to find the cracks. An alibi witness who was intimidated into silence. Security footage that was conveniently lost. The pieces didn't fit, and it became clear that Mark was a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. The real culprits, a pair of powerful real estate developers who had framed Mark to cover up a massive fraud scheme, were not accustomed to being challenged. They had connections that ran deep into the city's political and legal machinery, and they had assumed the case was closed. When word reached them that Judge Caldwell, of all people, was personally investigating the matter, they grew nervous. A warning was sent, subtle at first. A black sedan parked across the street from Lily's apartment building for hours on end. A dead bird left on their doorstep. It was a clear message, a predator circling its prey, a promise that the search for the truth would come at a very high price. Ignoring the veiled threats, Caldwell felt a pull he couldn't explain. He needed to see them, to reassure them, and perhaps to reassure himself. He drove to their apartment one evening, bringing bags of groceries, a simple human gesture that felt monumental to him. He sat in their small, tidy living room, his expensive wheelchair looking absurdly out of place, and listened as Mark spoke of his fears, but his attention was on Lily, who sat on the floor, drawing in a coloring book. She worked with intense concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly. She was a beacon of normalcy in his chaotic world, a small, steady light that was beginning to push back the shadows in his own heart. When it was time for him to leave, Lily ran to him and held up her drawing. It was a picture of a smiling man with grey hair, standing tall and straight under a bright yellow sun. Next to him stood a little girl with big brown eyes, and they were holding hands. "That's you," she said proudly. "And when you're all better." Arthur looked at the crayon drawing, at the simple, profound hope it represented, and felt his chest tighten. He realized with a terrifying clarity that his quest was no longer just about justice for an innocent man. He was now the protector of this child's faith, and the thought of failing her was more frightening than any threat or any painful memory. His fight had become her fight, and for the first time in 2 decades, he had a reason to win. The phone call came like a gunshot in the dead of night. a cold, metallic voice delivering a message that froze the blood in Arthur Caldwell's veins. They had Lily. The veiled threats had coalesced into a monstrous reality, and the weight of his decision to pursue justice crashed down upon him with suffocating force. But the initial wave of paralyzing terror was quickly consumed by something else, a cold, focused rage that burned away 2 decades of apathy. This wasn't the calculated anger of a judge. It was the primal, protective fury of a father. He immediately called Frank, his voice a low, dangerous command. Every favor he was owed, every connection he had cultivated in his long career was now a weapon to be deployed. The sprawling city of Chicago became a hunting ground, and he was the relentless hunter, his world narrowed to one single, sacred purpose: bring her home. Frank's network of informants, the ghosts and whispers of the city's underbelly, delivered. A tip pointed to a derelict warehouse district by the river, a graveyard of forgotten industries where buildings stood like skeletal remains against the bruised twilight sky. Caldwell didn't wait for the official police response he had reluctantly initiated. He went himself, the electric hum of his wheelchair a tense counterpoint to the silence of the deserted streets. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rust and decay. As he rounded a corner, he saw it, the familiar black sedan, parked like a predator in the shadows. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum of fear and ferocious hope. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But the image of Lily, alone in that darkness, obliterated all sense of self-preservation. This was his debt to pay, his battle to win. He rolled through the groaning metal doors into a vast, cavernous space. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the weak beams of light that sliced through the grimy, broken windows. And then he saw her. Lily stood between the 2 developers, her face pale and tear-streaked, but her eyes, when they found his, were still filled with that defiant, unshakable faith. One of the men, his expensive suit a grotesque mockery in the filth, had a hand clamped firmly on her shoulder. Caldwell moved forward. The sound of his wheels on the cracked concrete, an unnervingly steady advance. He stopped 10 feet away, positioning his chair as a solid, immovable barrier. "Let her go," he said, his voice stripped of all judicial formality, leaving only the raw, lethal promise of a man with nothing left to lose. "This ends now. You will release her, or I will spend the rest of my life and every penny of my fortune ensuring you die in a cage." The developers, men accustomed to power, to intimidating people with lawsuits and veiled threats, faltered. They saw not a crippled old man, but an unbreakable force, a man whose very brokenness had become his strength. They had miscalculated, assuming his physical limitations mirrored a weakness of spirit. In his eyes, they saw the certainty of their own destruction. Just as the standoff reached its breaking point, the distant but rapidly approaching wail of sirens sliced through the tension. Frank had played his part perfectly. A flicker of panic crossed the men's faces. With a rough shove, they pushed Lily forward and scrambled towards a darkened exit at the back of the warehouse. Caldwell didn't spare them a glance. His entire universe had contracted to the small, stumbling figure running towards him. He caught her, pulling her into his lap, burying his face in her hair as she sobbed into his coat. Later, after the chaos had subsided and a tearful, frantic Mark had been reunited with his daughter, Caldwell found a moment alone with Lily in the quiet of his study. He looked down at his still, useless legs, and then into her wide, trusting eyes, the source of this terrifying and beautiful upheaval in his life. "The men who took you, they thought this chair made me weak," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "For 20 years, I believed them." He took a shaky breath, the confession costing him everything and yet setting him free. "But the miracle, Lily, it wasn't the feeling in my toe that day. The real miracle was what I felt in my heart when you spoke. It started beating again. Please forgive me for being such a sad and bitter man." Lily simply reached up, her small hand warm against his cheek. "You don't need to walk to be a hero, Judge Arthur," she whispered, and he finally believed it. The courtroom was the same, yet entirely transformed. The oppressive silence was replaced by a buzz of quiet vindication, the cold marble floors now seeming to reflect a warmer, more hopeful light. Mark stood not at the defendant's table, but beside his lawyer, his shoulders finally unburdened from the weight of a false accusation. The verdict was a formality, a clean legal slate that washed away the stain of injustice. As the new presiding judge read the exoneration aloud, Lily, squeezed between Arthur and her father in the gallery, let out a small, joyful gasp that was lost in the respectful applause. From his place among the public, Arthur Caldwell watched the proceedings not as an arbiter of law, but as a simple witness to truth. He saw the real culprits, the developers, being led away in handcuffs, their expensive suits now looking like hollow costumes. Justice had been served, not by the impersonal grinding of the system's gears, but because one man had dared to listen to his heart. A week later, Arthur packed the last box from his judicial chambers. The leather-bound books that had once been his armor now felt like relics from another man's life. He paused before the portrait of Eleanor, his late wife, and for the first time in 2 decades, he smiled at her memory without a trace of the bitterness that had been his constant companion. He wasn't abandoning his past. He was finally making peace with it. His retirement was not an ending, but a radical, joyful beginning. He wheeled himself out into the hallway, leaving the title of the Gavel behind with the empty office. He was simply Arthur now, a man with a new purpose. His fortune, once a sterile monument to a successful but empty career, would now become the engine of the Lily Foundation, an organization dedicated to ensuring that no innocent person would ever have to face the cold machinery of the law alone, a promise he made to the little girl who had saved him. The following spring found them not in a courtroom, but in Lincoln Park, under a canopy of green leaves and a brilliant blue sky. The whir of Arthur's wheelchair was a cheerful sound as he raced Lily towards the distant chime of an ice cream truck, their laughter echoing across the grass. Mark watched them, a gentle smile on his face, the weariness of the past year finally replaced by a deep and abiding peace. The adoption papers were finalized, making their strange, beautiful little family official. Arthur was no longer just a benefactor or a protector. He was a grandfather in every way that mattered. He had traded his gavel for a push rim, his robes for a comfortable sweater, and his solitude for the chaotic, wonderful mess of family life. He had never felt more powerful, more alive, or more whole than he did in that simple, sun-drenched moment. A man who had found his strength not in standing tall, but in learning to kneel, metaphorically, to a child's faith. The Lily Foundation thrived, its small office becoming a beacon of hope in the city's forgotten neighborhoods. Arthur didn't preside over it, he served it, offering guidance and wisdom. His presence, a quiet testament to the idea that justice required more than laws. It required compassion. His life was no longer defined by the accident that had taken his legs, but by the miracle that had restored his soul. On his desk, next to stacks of case files, sat a single framed photograph, the 3 of them in the park, squinting happily into the sun. He finally understood. The real miracle wasn't a twitch in his toe. It was the profound, life-altering power of a human connection forged in a moment of impossible faith. Stories like this remind us that even in the darkest of courtrooms, a small voice can echo with the force of a verdict, changing everything. It's because of your support that we can continue to bring these powerful reminders of hope to light. So please consider subscribing to keep the light shining.